as per tradition on the general public affair, rather, you had to assassinate your Monday in order to have the rest of the week hostage. So I hope you did, and this is how we kick it off with good music, good vibes. And it is time for us to get into African Insights, which is week 3 of African Insight. As you remember, we started off with the burning question, which was, what is Africa, rather, or what does being an African mean? And the issue of decolonization. And today we're talking African languages, and I'm not alone in studio. I'm joined in by Chris and Patrick. Could you just give a brief introduction of yourselves?
Sure. Hello, everyone. And also, I just want to say a happy Africa Month to everyone. So I'm Chris, and I'm currently a student at UJ, and I'm also part of the African Insights course. And I'm doing my master's in African literature. Yeah, so that's what I'm doing.
Okay, Patrick, over to you.
Hello, good evening, everyone. I'm Patrick from the Philosophy Department of UJ, and I'm also part of the team of the African Insights.
So today, what are we talking about? We're talking African languages, but from which aspects are we talking about African languages?
Yeah, that's a very good question. And I'd actually like to start with a quote from Nelson Mandela and what he says about language in general. He says, if you talk to a man in a language he understands, that goes to his head. If you talk to him in his language, that goes to his heart. So because we are in Africa, there's a very troubling and complicated question. How do we use languages on the continent?
Yeah.
Okay, so it becomes part of our identities, and what this quote is saying is, it's actually quite controversial, not controversial, but it's detailed. If you go into this quote, he's saying if you speak to him in his language, that goes to his heart.
Yeah, it goes to his heart, basically touches the person.
Yeah, and it speaks to their identity and what the person is comfortable and how they use language in their everyday experience.
And Patrick, what's your take on that?
My take is on a literary point of view. Obianju Awali, who wrote The Dead End of African Literature, he was a university lecturer, minority rights.
Could you please just, sorry to interrupt, just bring the mic closer to your mouth, yeah.
He was a university lecturer, minority rights activist, a politician, among many other things. And he said this: the uncritical acceptance of English and French as the inevitable medium for educated African writing is misdirected and has no chance of advancing African literature and culture. Until these writers and their Western midwives accept the fact that any true African literature must be written in African languages, they are merely pursuing a dead end. And what he suggests really is that the African languages need to be developed. And that's what I want to put out to the listeners. What do they think about this when we say that African languages need to be developed?
You can join in the conversations on Twitter at UJFM, at Smurfzine, hashtag the general public affair, hashtag African Insights. But my question that I have, what qualifies a language to be African? How do we know that this African is genuinely African? And through the history of linguistics and traveling the world, I believe that Africa has been influenced and has been sort of like diluted with a whole lot of languages. So what defines or what qualifies a language to be African?
Yeah, and that is a very important question. And it's difficult, especially considering Africa's history of colonization, where our languages have kind of, our African languages, indigenous languages, languages that originate on the continent, have taken quite a back seat because of the influence of these European languages. So we have another writer that we deal with in our course, called Chinua Achebe, who is a Nigerian writer, and he mentions a very important point here. He says that Nigeria is a country, it's an arbitrary creation of the British. So that means before, there are hundreds of communities and linguistic communities in this country. And now, because of colonization, we have this kind of this English imposed on this country and on the communities. And they have kind of owned the language and used it to their own advantage. So while we should, I don't want to say should, but we use the the European languages such as English, French, Portuguese, and so on. But that doesn't mean we should not try to advance our indigenous African languages.
And over to you, Patrick.
You've asked a very pertinent question. What makes an African language African?
Yeah.
geographically, I would say an African language would emanate from Africa, one of the African languages. Swahili, for example, Zulu, for example, Isikosa, for example. These are languages that are indigenous to the people of Africa. People of Africa speak them. But the important question about languages is, if you consider the fact that the language of business, for example, is English, the language of education is English, why don't we take our indigenous languages and make them languages of business, languages of communication, languages of study? Is this a feasible project? For example, at universities, instead of learning, say, in English or in French, we learn in isiZulu. Is that a feasible project? These are the kind of questions that we want the listeners to weigh in and contribute to this discussion, whether they think it's possible to have indigenous languages developed to an extent that they replace perhaps English, German and French, and many other foreign languages spoken on the African continent.
Yeah.
So I think for us to achieve such a change whereby we're using our African indigenous languages, it has to start from the top, whereby, I mean, we are governed by politics. And the main language or medium of instruction in politics is English. So how do we go about making sure that it drills down from the top to the general public? And looking also at the education system in South Africa, it is possible to teach a child at like a primary education level in their indigenous languages. But now going into high school and tertiary, it becomes a problem, because how do you go and restructure science into Zulu or restructure accounting into like Sesotho, like purely, not even using words in English?
You see, that's a very interesting question. The assumption is that English has always been a language of business, a language of science. What we forget that English alongside science has developed. So the terminology, for example, has developed as science has developed. And I think it is possible that African languages also can develop in that sense.
And I think you mentioned we should start at the top.
Yeah.
I think actually we need to start at the bottom, at the base, and we need to develop. We need to, like the Pan South African Language Board has many policies and things in place, and legislation as well, to ensure the rights of indigenous languages. And we need to start. We need to develop, and like you mentioned, Patrick, the feasibility of African languages in education. So there's a very interesting article that you can find on the African Insights blog, where the writer looks at the feasibility and the productivity of African languages. So think of all the businesses, all the job opportunities that could be created if we develop African languages. So you have writers, you have language experts, also you have publishing, you have people who develop, who write, who think of the terminology. Then you have people in publishing. Then also even drivers who take the textbooks to all the schools and stuff. It's such a big job market that we can exploit.
But earlier you mentioned something about African literature. But when you look at most of the books that are categorized under the African literature category, most of them are written in English. So what qualifies them to be African literature, or what is really African literature?
And this is why earlier on we say that African languages need to be developed. Can you imagine, for example, Shakespeare writing his literary pieces of work in any other language other than English? This is the complication. So we in Africa, take for example some of our eminent writers, Chinua Achebe, for example, he writes in English. He could have written in Igbo, he could have written in one of the Nigerian languages. And that's exactly the point that we are driving. That can we develop African language to an extent that we have Shakespeare's equivalent of Shakespeare in Africa, equivalent of Spencer, Chaucer in Africa, and many other prominent writers, so that our literature is not literature in English, but literature in African languages.
Mm-hmm. And I do think that comparison can often be a little tricky when we compare and we try and look for an African equivalent of the Shakespeare. I think there are many writers on this continent, emerging writers. I'm a student of literature and I'm reading up about all of these people, and it's so interesting and it's amazing. And yes, often these works are written in English, but there are so many translations as well. So translation is another area in which we can look. These writers can write in indigenous languages. The people who speak those languages can appreciate them. We can also try and translate and read each other's literature, and thereby learning. And since this is Africa Month, try and find a unity.
So, Chris, you mentioned earlier that English and French and Portuguese, those are colonial languages. So, this introducing African languages within academia, would you call this like decolonization of medium of instruction?
Yeah, I would say so. And also, I think it's important to think of Africanization as well. So when we think of decolonization, yes, we're deconstructing the colonial project, but also Africanizing is a more positive kind of way of moving forward. So definitely we have these colonial languages, but also remember, languages change. That is the fundamental aspect of a language, is it changes. So even though these are kind of European or colonial languages, as Ngugi wa Thiong'o is another Kenyan writer we deal with in the course, he questions this, and he is saying we have to forge a new kind of English to suit our African surroundings. So definitely we should kind of, in our university systems, try and use African languages more openly and try and move forward, definitely.
Yeah, you can join in the conversations on Twitter at UJFM, at Smevzindo, hashtag The General Public Affair, hashtag African Insight. But for now, we're taking a young music break. We'll be back in a few.